All right. Howdy, everybody. Jimmy Song here. Welcome to another episode of White Paper Wednesday. This is a show where I go through and read a white paper. This week, we're going to start on one of my favorite papers of all time. This is Nick Szabo Shelling Out. It's been a while since I've read it, so it'll be good for me to go over it. Hopefully, it'll help you understand where a lot of the origins of Bitcoin came from. Anyway, let's get straight to the actual paper. This is hosted on NakamotoInstitute.org, and if you go to literature, there's a bunch of articles. All of these are worth reading. I'm just I picked out Shelling Out the Origins of Money because it is something that is just so awesome and so worth reading, and hopefully you'll get something really good out of it. Anyway, it's published, Shelling Out the Origins of Money, published in 2002 by Nick Szabo. The abstract is the precursors of money, along with language, enabled early modern humans to solve problems of cooperation that animals cannot, including problems of reciprocal altruism, kin altruism, and the mitigation of aggression. These precursors shared with non-fiat currencies very specific characteristics. They were not merely symbolic or decorative objects. All right, so let's go through these. I'm probably going to cover a third to a half of these, not all of them because it's a little too long. We'll have a part two next week, though. So money. From the very start, England's 17th century colonies in America had a problem: a shortage of coin. The British idea was to grow large amounts of tobacco, cut timber for the ships of their global navy and merchant marine and so forth, sending in return the supplies they felt were needed to keep the Americans working. In effect, early colonists were supposed to both work for the company and shop at the company store. The investors and the crown much preferred this to paying in coin what the farmers might ask, letting the farmers themselves buy the supplies and, heaven forbid, keep some of the profits as well. So a couple of allusions here. Work for the company and shop at the company store. This is actually kind of what happened in the U.S. Later on. I think it was late 1800s, early 1900s, where they would have like coal miners, for example, and they would go work for coal mine, and they would get basically credits that they would work for the coal mining company, but the coal mining company also built all the housing and ran all the stores. So this is what it's talking about: work for the company and shop at the company store. And what Nick Szabo is saying is that this situation was very similar in early colonial America. A lot of the colonists were supposed to both work for the government of England, more or less, and shop at the at the store and have really no money or medium of exchange. Really, the colonist solution was at hand, but it took a few years for them to realize it. The natives had money, but it was very different from the money Europeans were used to. American Indians had been using money for millennia, and quite useful money it turned out to be for the newly arrived Europeans. Despite the prejudice among some that only metal with the faces of their political leaders stamped on it constituted real money. Worse, the New England natives used neither silver nor gold. Instead, they used the most appropriate money to be found in their environment: the durable skeleton parts of their prey. Specifically, they used wampum, shells of the clam Venus mercenaria and its relatives strung onto pendants. So this is what wampums look like. Necklace of wampum. During trade, the beads were counted, removed, and reassembled on new necklaces. Native American shell beads were also sometimes woven into belts or other mnemonic and ceremonial devices that demonstrated the wealth and commitment of a tribe to a treaty. So essentially, this was used in early colonial America, or before colonial America, by the Native Americans as a way to as money. And basically, because there wasn't enough metal, this was the solution that was found for early European settlers of the British Crown. Clams were found only at the ocean, but wampum traded far inland. Seashell money of a variety of types could be found in tribes across the American continent. The Iroquois managed to collect the largest wampum treasure of any tribe without venturing anywhere near the clam's habitat. So they were, I think, fairly inland, but they had the most wealth, so to speak, stored in wampum because it was such a good currency. It had all of the right properties. Only a handful of tribes, such as the Narragansetts, specialized in manufacturing wampum, while hundreds of other tribes, many of them hunter-gatherers, used it. Wampum pendants came in a variety of lengths, with the number of beads proportional to the length. Pendants could be cut or joined to form a pendant of length equal to the price paid. So essentially, they had high divisibility because you can lace them up in necklaces and so on, and you could cut them, and using whatever string, you can pay change or a specific amount. Once they got over their hang-up about what constitutes real money, the colonists went wild trading for and with wampum. Clams entered the American vernacular as another way to say money. We still use that today. We say, clams as money. The Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, now New York, took out a large loan from an English-American bank in wampum. After a while, the British authorities were forced to go along. So between 1637 and 1661, wampum became legal tender in England. Colonists now had a liquid medium of exchange, and trade in the colonies flourished. The beginning of the end of the wampum came when the British started shipping more coin to the Americas, and Europeans started applying their mass manufacturing techniques. By 1661, British authorities had thrown in the towel and decided it would pay in coin of the realm, which being real gold and silver, and its minting audited and branded by the Crown, had even better monetary qualities than shell. In that year, wampum ceased to be legal tender in New England. In 1710, briefly became legal tender in North Carolina. It continued to be used as a medium of exchange in some cases into the 20th century, but its value had been inflated 100-fold by Western harvesting and manufacturing techniques, and it gradually went the route that gold and silver jewelry had gone in the West after the invention of coinage, from well-crafted money to decoration. The American language of shell money became a quaint holdover. 100 clams became $100. Shelling out came to mean paying in coins or bills, and eventually by check or credit card. Little did we know that we had touched the very origin of our species. So in other words, it was used but as money until Europeans figured out how to mass produce wampum, so it became less useful as money. You can't really do that with silver and gold. It's atomically very different than anything that you can produce. So that ended up making the wampum go away as currency. Collectibles. Native American money took many forms besides shells. Furs, teeth, and a variety of other objects with properties we will discuss below were also commonly used as media of exchange. 12,000 years ago, in what is now Washington State, the Clovis people developed some marvelously long chert blades. The only problem, they break far too easily. They were useless for cutting. The flints were being made for the sheer enjoyment, or for some other purpose that had nothing to do with cutting. As we shall see, this seeming frivolity was, quite likely, actually very important to their survival. Native Americans had not, however, been the first to make artful but useless blades, nor had they invented shell money, nor for that matter had Europeans, even though they too in ages past had widely used shells and teeth for money, not to mention cattle, gold, silver, weapons, and shells. Asians had used all that and follow axes issued by governments to boot, but they as well imported this institution. For archaeologists have found pendants of shells dating to the early Paleolithic that could easily have substituted for Native American money. Beads made from shells of the pea-sized snail Nacerius Prausinianus that lived in a nearby estuary. That's from South Africa. Wow. In the late 1990s, archaeologist Stanley Ambrose discovered in a rock shelter in the Rift Valley of Kenya a cache of beads made of ostrich eggshell, blanks, and shell fragments. They are dated using the argon-argon ratio of to at least 40,000 years old. Pierced animal teeth have been found in Spain, also dating to this time. Perforated shells have also been recovered from an early Paleolithic sites in Lebanon. Recently, regular shells, prepared as strung beads and dating back further still to 75,000 BP, have been found in Blombos Cave, South Africa. That's what we saw up here. These are ostrich eggshell beads. Our modern subspecies had migrated to Europe, and necklaces of shell and tooth appear there from 40,000 BP onward. Shell and tooth pendants appear in Australia from 30,000 BP onward. In all cases, the work is highly skilled, indicating a practice that probably dates much further back in time. The origin of collecting and decorating is quite likely Africa, the original homeland of the anatomically modern subspecies. Collecting and making necklaces must have had an important selection benefit, since it was costly. Manufacture of these shells took a great deal of both skill and time during an era when humans lived constantly on the brink of starvation. So, essentially, the fact that this is something that that a lot of people, like in ancient times, seem to have spent a lot of time doing, despite the fact that they were always on the verge of starvation. So this had some selection benefit, is what Nick Szabo is arguing here. Practically all human creatures, even those that do not engage in substantial trade or that use more modern forms of money, make and enjoy jewelry and value certain objects more for their artistic or heirloom qualities than for their utility. We humans collect necklaces of shells and other kinds of jewelry for the sheer enjoyment of it. For the evolutionary psychologists, an explanation that humans do something for the sheer enjoyment of it is not an explanation at all, but for the posing of a problem. Why do so many people find the collection and wearing of jewelry enjoyable? For the evolutionary psychologist, this question becomes, what caused this pleasure to evolve? Details of necklace from a burial at Sungir, Russia, 28,000 BP. Interlocking and interchangeable beads. Each mammoth ivory bead may have required 1 or 2 hours of labor to manufacture. Wow. Evolution, cooperation, and collectibles. Evolutionary psychology starts with a key mathematical discovery of John Maynard Smith. Using models of populations of co-evolving genes from the well-developed area of population genetics, Smith posited genes that can code for strategies, good or bad, used in simple strategic problems. The games of game theory. Smith proved that these genes, competing to be propagated into future generations, will evolve strategies that are Nash equilibria to the strategic problems presented by the competition. These games include the prisoner's dilemma, a prototypical problem of cooperation, and hawk dove, a prototypical problem of aggression and its mitigation. So what he's talking about is a little bit of game theory, and essentially, I'm gonna hide this guy. Essentially, what this is saying is that certain kinds of prisoners, certain money has like certain evolutionary things have an equilibria based on their fitness. Critical to Smith's theory is that these strategic games, while played out between phenotypes approximately, are in fact games between genes at the ultimate level, the level of competition to be propagated. The genes, not necessarily the individuals, influence behavior as if they were boundedly rational. coding for strategies as optimal as possible, within the limits of what phenotypes can express given the biological raw materials and previous evolutionary history. And selfish, to use Richard Dawkins' metaphor. Genetic influences on behavior are adaptations to the social problems presented by genes competing through their phenotype. Smith called these evolved Nash equilibria evolutionary stable strategies. These epicycles, built on top of the earlier individual selection theory, such as sexual selection and kin selection, disappear into this more general model, which in a Copernican manner puts the genes rather than individuals at the center of the theory. Thus, Dawkins' metaphorical and often misused phrase selfish gene to describe Smith's theory. Few other species cooperate on the order of even Paleolithic humans. In some cases, brood care, the colonies of ants, termites, and bees, and so forth, animals cooperate because they are kin, because they can help copies of their selfish genes found in their kin. In some highly constrained cases, there is also ongoing cooperation between non-kin, which evolutionary psychologists call reciprocal altruism. As Dawkins describes it, unless an exchange of favors is simultaneous, and sometimes even then, one party or the other can cheat, and they usually do. This is the typical result of a game theorist call the prisoner's dilemma. If both parties cooperate, both would be better off, but if one cheats, he gains at the expense of the sucker. In a population of cheaters and suckers, the cheaters always win. However, sometimes animals come to cooperate through repeated interactions and a strategy called tit for tat. Start cooperating and keep cooperating until the other party cheats, then defect yourself. This threat of retaliation motivates continued cooperation. He's describing essentially game theory, basically. The situations where such cooperation in fact occurs in the animal world are highly constrained. The main constraint is that such cooperation is restricted to relationships where at least one of the participants is more or less forced to be in the proximity of the other. The more common case is when parasites and hosts whose bodies they share evolve into symbiotes. If the interests of the parasite and the host coincide so that both working together would be more fit than either on their own, i.e., the parasite is also providing some benefit to the host, then if they can play a successful game of tit for tat, they will evolve into symbiosis, a state where their interests and especially the exit mechanism of genes from one generation to the next coincide. They become as a single organism. However, there is much more than cooperation going on here. There is also exploitation. They occur simultaneously. The situation is analogous to an institution humans would develop, tribute, which we analyze below. So he's describing sort of the biological basis for some of this stuff. And what he's saying is, when you have multiple species and so on, what behavior they learn has some sort of game theoretical optimum based on the number of many other, whoever else is around. Some very special instances occur that do not involve parasite and host sharing the same body and evolving symbiotes. Rather, they involve non-kin animals and highly constrained territory. A prominent example Dawkins describes are cleaner. These fish swim in and out of the mouths of their hosts, eating the bacteria there, benefiting the host fish. The host fish could cheat, it could wait for the cleaner to finish its job, then eat it, but they don't. Since they are both mobile, they are both potentially free to leave the relationship. However, the cleaner fish have evolved a very strong sense of individual territoriality and have stripes and dances that are difficult to spoof, much like a difficult to forge brand logo. So the host fish know where to go to get clean, and they know that if they cheat, they will have to start over again with a new distrustful cleaner fish. The entrance costs and thus the exit costs of the relationship are high, so that it works out without cheating. Besides, the cleaner fish are tiny, so the benefit of eating them is not large compared to the benefit of a small number of, or even one, cleaning. One of the most pertinent examples is the vampire bat. As their name suggests, they suck the blood of prey animals. The interesting thing is that on a good night, they bring back a surplus. On a bad night, nothing. Their dark business is highly unpredictable. As a result, the lucky bats often share blood with the less lucky bats in their cave. They vomit up the blood, and the grateful recipient eats it. The vast majority of these recipients are kin. Out of 110 such regurgitations witnessed by the strong stomach biologist G.S. Wilkinson, 77 were cases of mothers feeding their children, and most of the other cases also involved genetic kin. There were, however, a small number that could not be explained by kin altruism. To demonstrate that these were cases of reciprocal altruism, Wilkinson combined the population of bats from two different groups. Bats, with very rare exception, only fed old friends from their original. Such cooperation requires building a long-term relationship where partners interact often, recognize each other, and keep track of each other's behavior. The bat cave helps constrain the bats into long-term relationships where such bonds can form. We will see that some humans too chose highly risky and discontinuous prey items and shared the resulting surpluses with non-kin. Indeed, they accomplished this to a far greater extent than the vampire bat. How they did so is the main subject of our essay. Dawkins suggests money is a formal token of delayed reciprocal altruism, but then pursues this fascinating idea no further. We will. Among small human groups, public reputation can supersede retaliation by a single individual to motivate cooperation and delayed reciprocation. However, reputational beliefs can suffer from two major kinds of errors. Errors of about which person did what, and errors in appraising the value or damage caused by that act. So you can ascribe it to the wrong person, or you don't know the magnitude of what they did. The need to remember faces and favors is a major cognitive hurdle, but one that most humans find relatively easy to overcome. Recognizing faces is easy, but remembering that a favor took place when such memory needs to be recalled can be harder. Remembering the specifics about a favor that gave it a certain value to the favored is harder still. Avoiding disputes and misunderstandings can be improbable or prohibitively difficult. So this is the problem of memory. If you are doing mutual favors for one another, you need to remember what favors have been done, and this is where money comes into the picture. The appraisal or value measurement problem is very broad. For humans, it comes into play in any system of exchange, reciprocation of favors, barter, money, credit, employment, or purchase in a market. It is important in extortion, taxation, tribute, and the setting of judicial penalties. It is even important in reciprocal altruism in animals. Consider monkeys exchanging favors, say a piece of fruit for back scratches. Mutual grooming can remove ticks and fleas that an individual can't see or reach. But just how much grooming versus how many pieces of fruit constitutes a reciprocation that both sides will consider to be fair, or in other words, not a defection. Is 20 minutes of back scratching worth one piece of fruit or two? And how big a piece? Even the simple case of trading blood for blood is more complicated than it seems. Just how do bats estimate the value of blood they have received? Do they estimate the value of a favor by weight, by bulk, by taste, by its ability to satiate hunger, or other variables? Just the same, measurement complications arise even in the simple monkey exchange of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. For the vast majority of potential exchanges, the measurement problem is intractable for animals. Even more than the easier problem of remembering faces and matching them to favors, the ability of both parties to agree with sufficient accuracy on the estimate of the value of a favor in the first place is probably the main barrier to reciprocal altruism among animals. Just the stone toolkit of early Paleolithic man has survived us for us to find was in some ways too complicated for a brain of our size. Keeping track of favors involving them, who manufactures what quality of tool for whom, and therefore who owed whom what, and so on, would have been too difficult outside the boundaries of the clan. Add on to that, quite likely, a larger variety of organic objects, ephemeral services such as grooming, and so on, that have not survived. After even a small fraction of these goods has been transferred and services performed, our brains, as inflated as they are, could not possibly keep track of who owed what to whom. Today, we often write these things down, but Paleolithic man had no writing. If cooperation occurred between clans and even tribes, as the archaeological record indicates in fact occurred, the problem gets far worse still, since hunter-gatherer tribes are usually highly antagonistic and mutually distrustful. So essentially what he's talking about is the problem of remembering. And this is setting up essentially the case or the reason why money evolved or why money came in. If clams can be money, furs can be money, gold can be money, and so on. If money is not just coins or notes issued by a government under legal tender laws, but rather can be a wide variety of objects, then what is money anyway? And why did humans, often living on the brink of starvation, spend so much time making and enjoying these necklaces when they could have been doing more hunting and gathering? 19th century economist Carl Menger first described how money evolves naturally and inevitably from a sufficient volume of commodity barter. In modern economic terms, the story is similar to Menger's. Barter requires a coincidence of interest. Alice grows some pecans and wants some apples. Bob grows apples and wants some pecans. They just want to have their orchards near each other, and they just happen to have their orchards near each other, and Alice just happens to trust Bob enough to wait between pecan harvesting time and apple harvesting time. Assuming all these conditions are met, barter works pretty well. But if Alice was growing oranges, even if Bob wanted oranges as well as pecans, they'd be out of luck. Oranges and apples don't both grow well in the same climate. If Alice and Bob didn't trust each other and couldn't find the third party to be a middleman or enforce a contract, they'd also be out of luck. Further complications could arise. Alice and Bob can't fully articulate a promise to sell pecans or apples in the future because, among other possibilities, Alice could keep the best pecans to herself and Bob the best apples, giving the other the drag. Comparing the qualities as well as the quantities of two different kinds of goods is all the more difficult when the state of one of the goods is only a memory. Furthermore, neither can anticipate events such as a bad harvest. These complications greatly add to the problem of Alice and Bob deciding whether separated reciprocal and altruism has truly been reciprocal. These kinds of complications increase the greater the time interval and uncertainty between the original transaction and the reciprocation. In other words, trade becomes really, really hard without money. And there are all sorts of problems, as Nick Szabo is pointing out, and Carl Menger. A related problem is that, as engineers would say, barter doesn't scale. Barter works well at small volumes, but becomes increasingly costly at large, until it becomes too costly to be worth the effort. If there are n goods and services to be traded, a barter market requires n squared prices. 5 products would require 25 prices, which is not too bad. But 500 products would require 250,000 prices, which is far beyond what is practical for one person to keep track of. With money, there are only n prices, 500 products, 500 prices. Money for this purpose can work either as a medium of exchange or simply as a standard of value, as long as the number of money prices themselves do not grow too large to memorize or change too often. The latter problem, along with an implicit insurance contract, along with the lack of a competitive market, may explain why prices were often set by long-evolved custom rather than proximate negotiation. All right, barter requires, in other words, coincidence of supply or skills, preferences, time, and low transaction costs. Its cost increases far faster than the growth in the number of goods traded. Barter certainly works much better than no trade at all and has been widely practiced, but it is quite limited compared to trade with money. Primitive money existed long before large-scale trade networks. Money had an even earlier and more important use. Money greatly improved the workings of even small barter networks by greatly reducing the need for credit. Simultaneous coincidence of preference was far rarer than coincidences across long spans of time. With money, Alice could gather for Bob during the ripening of the blueberries this month, and Bob hunt for Alice during the migration of the mammoth herd 6 months later, without either having to keep track of who owed who, or trust the other's memory or honesty. A mother's much greater investment in child rearing could be secured by gifts of unforgeable value. Money converts the division of labor problem from a prisoner's dilemma to a simple swap. So in other words, instead of keeping track of everything and having to punish somebody after they betray you, you can just use money, and that way you just get fair value, and then you spend when you need to. It becomes much fairer and easier to enforce, and doesn't require everyone to play along with the optimum in a game theoretical way. The proto money used by many hunter gatherer tribes looks very different from modern money. Now serves a different role in our modern culture and had a function probably limited to small trade networks and other local institutions discussed below. I will thus call such money collectibles instead of money proper. The term used in the anthropological literature for such objects are usually either money, defined more broadly than just government printed notes and coins, but more narrowly that we will use collectibles in this essay, or the vague valuable, which sometimes refers to items that are not collectibles in the sense of this essay. Reasons for choosing the term collectible over other possible names for proto money will become apparent. Collectibles had very specific attributes. They were not merely symbolic, while the concrete objects and attributes valued as collectible could vary between cultures. They were far from arbitrary. The primary and ultimate evolutionary function of collectibles was as a medium for storing and transferring. Some kinds of collectibles, such as wampum, could be quite functional as money as moderns know it, where the economic and social conditions encourage trade. I will occasionally use the term proto money and primitive money interchangeably with collectible when discussing pre-coinage media of wealth transfer. All right, so hopefully you got that. Basically, he's using the term collectible for proto money, or the money that we've been examining a little bit. A lot of collectibles are used as money, but he's distinguishing them both for a reason. Gains from wealth transfers. People, clans, or tribes trade voluntarily because both sides believe they gain something. Their beliefs about the value may change after the trade, for example, as they gain experience with a good or service. Their beliefs at the time of the trade, although to some degree inaccurate as to the value, are still usually correct as to the existence of gain. Especially in light of intertribal trade, restricted to high value items, there was strong incentive for each party to get their beliefs right. Thus, trade almost always did benefit both parties. Trade created value as much as the physical act of making something. Because individuals, clans, and tribes all vary in their preferences, vary in their ability to satisfy these preferences, and vary in the beliefs that they have about these skills and preferences and the objects that are consequent of them, there are always gains to be made from trade. Whether the costs of making these trades, transaction cards, are low enough to make the trades worthwhile is another matter. In our civilization, far more trades are possible than were through most of human history. Nevertheless, as we shall see, some kinds of trades were worth more than the transaction cost. For some cultures, probably back to the beginning of Homo sapiens sapiens. So, essentially, trade is common because people have different abilities and preferences. And as a result, you end up trading, and to have trade, you need some sort of wealth transfer mechanism. Voluntary spot trades are not the only kinds of trades that benefit from lower transaction costs. This is the key to understanding the origin and evolution of money. Family heirlooms could be used as collateral to remove the credit risk from delayed exchanges. The ability of a victorious tribe to extract tribute from the vanquished was of great benefit to the victor. The victor's ability to collect tribute benefited from some of the same kinds of transaction cost techniques as did trade. So did the plaintiff in assessment of damages for offenses against custom or law, and kin groups arranging a marriage. Kin also benefited from timely and peaceful gifts of wealth by inheritance. The major human life events that modern cultures segregate from the world of trade benefited no less than trade, and sometimes more so from techniques that lower transaction costs. None of these techniques was more effective, important, or early than primitive money collectible. So, tribute and stuff like that. I'm sure he'll get to more. But basically, if you have some time delay in between things, or if you're getting credit for something, then you need some way to some collateral, if you will. It's essentially credit, and you need collateral in order to issue credit. So he's saying collectibles filled that role. When Homo sapiens sapiens displaced Homo sapien neanderthalensis, population explosions followed. Evidence from the takeover in Europe from 40,000 to 35,000 BP indicates that Homo sapiens sapiens increased the carrying capacity of its environment by a factor of 10 over Homo sapien neanderthalensis. An example, the population density increased tenfold. Not only that, the newcomers had spared time to create the world's first art, such as the wonderful cave paintings, a wide variety of well-crafted figurines, and of course the wonderful pendants and necklaces of shells, teeth, and eggshell. These objects were not useless decorations. Newly effective wealth transfers made possible by collectibles, as well as other probable advances of the era, language created new cultural institutions that quite likely played the leading role in the increase of carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is just how many people will be able to live in a particular amount of land. The newcomers, Homo sapiens sapiens, had the same size brain, weaker bones, and smaller muscles than the Neanderthals. Their hunting tools were more sophisticated, but in 35,000 BP, they were basically the same tool. They were probably not even twice as effective, much less 10 times more effective. The biggest difference may have been the wealth transfers made more effective or even possible by collectibles. Homo sapiens sapiens took pleasure from collecting shells, making jewelry out of them, showing them off, and trading them. Homo sapiens neanderthalensis did not. The same dynamic would have been at work tens of thousands of years earlier on the Serengeti, when Homo sapiens sapiens first appeared in that dynamic maelstrom of human evolution, Africa. We shall describe how collectibles lower transaction costs in each kind of wealth transfer. In the voluntary free gift of inheritance, involuntary mutual trade or marriage, and in the involuntary transfers of legal judgments and tribute. All these kinds of value transfer occurred in many cultures of human history, probably from the beginning of Homo sapiens sapiens. The gains to be made by one or both parties from these major life event transfers of wealth were so great that they occurred despite high transaction costs. Compared to modern money, primitive money had a very low velocity. It might be transferred only a handful of times in an average individual's lifetime. Nevertheless, a durable collectible, what today we would call an heirloom, could persist for many generations and added substantial value at each transfer, often making the transfer even possible at all. Tribes, therefore, often spend large amounts of time on the seemingly frivolous tasks of manufacturing and exploring for the raw materials of jewelry and other collectibles. In other words, the time and effort spent on creating collectibles, which is actually quite a large amount of time, actually made things a lot more efficient because you could cooperate a lot easier. Instead of having sort of like betrayal, prisoners dilemma games, and so on, you had just sort of fixed exchange that you can use at any time, and that made humans 10 times more efficient than Neanderthals that were essentially stronger and so on. So let's just do this one more section, and then we'll save the rest for next time. All right, so the Kula Ring. The Kula trading network of pre-colonial Melanesia. The Kula valuable stored as high-power money and mnemonic for stories and gossip. Many of the goods traded, mostly agricultural products, were available in different seasons and so could not be traded in kind. Kula Collectibles solved this double coincidence problem in an unforgeably costly wearable for security and circulated literally money. Necklaces circulated clockwise and arm shells counterclockwise in a very regular pattern. By solving the double coincidence problem, an arm shell or necklace could prove more valuable than its cost after only a few trades, but could circulate for decades. Gossip and stories about the prior owners of the collectibles further provided information about the upstream credit and liquidity. In other Neolithic cultures, collectibles, usually shells, circulated in a less regular pattern but had similar purposes and attributes. For any institution in which wealth transfer is an important component, we will ask the following question. What coincidence in time between the event, the supply for the transferred good, and demand for the transferred good was necessary? How unlikely or how high a barrier to the wealth transfer did the improbability of coincidence represent? Would the wealth transfers formed a closed loop of collectibles just based on that institution, or other wealth transfer institutions necessary to complete circulation. Taking the actual flow graph of monetary circulation seriously is critical to understanding the money. General circulation among a wide variety of trades did not and would not exist for most of human prehistory. Without completed and repeated loops, collectibles would not circulate and would become worthless. A collectible, to be worth making, had to add value in enough transactions to amortize its cost. We shall first examine the kind of transfer most familiar and economically important to us today. Okay, so this will be what will be talked about. But basically, in order for a collectible to become useful as wealth transfer, it needs to have some sort of some sort of way in which you know it comes it gets used enough that the cost gets amortized, and clearly it did, because it supported 10 times as many people. And so Nick Szabo is speculating here that this was an enormous benefit to humankind. So anyway, that's it for the first half of the Shelling Out article. I'll be reading more of it. Please pound that like button and let me know in the comments if you're enjoying stuff like this. I do know that many of you guys are sort of starving for content because you're at home all the time. So I don't know if this is something that you're interested in, but if it is, please let me know. I'll try to read more of it and so on. Anyway, that's about it for now. Fiat delenda est, this song.